Text Talks.
Hi everyone, this is Dr. Brian Black again, and this week's mini lecture is on the life of the Buddha. So, I want to start today's lecture by reading from you a description of the life of the Buddha from a modern textbook. This description is from a book called What the Buddha Taught, and it's by Walpola Rahula. It goes, "The Buddha, whose personal name was Siddhartha and family name Gautama, lived in North India in the 6th century BC. His father, Suddhodana, was the ruler of the kingdom of the Shakyas. His mother was queen. According to the custom of the time, he was married quite young, at the age of 16, to a beautiful and devoted princess named Yasodhara. The young prince lived in his palace with every luxury at his command, but all of a sudden, confronted with the reality of life and the suffering of mankind, he decided to find the solution, the way out of this universal suffering. At the age of 29, soon after the birth of his only child, Rahula, he left his kingdom and became an ascetic in search of this solution. For 6 years, the ascetic Gautama wandered about the valley of the Ganges, meeting famous religious teachers, studying and following their systems and methods, and submitting himself to rigorous ascetic practices. They did not satisfy him, so he abandoned all traditional religions and their methods and went his own way. It was thus that one evening, seated under a tree, since then known as the Bodhi or Bo tree, the tree of wisdom, on the bank of the river Naranjara, at the Bodh Gaya, near Gaya in modern Bihar, at the age of 35, Gautama attained enlightenment, after which he was known as the Buddha, the Enlightened One. After his enlightenment, Gautama the Buddha delivered his first sermon to a group of 5 ascetics, his old colleagues, in the Deer Park near modern Benares. From that day, for 45 years, he taught all classes of men and women, kings and peasants, Brahmins and outcasts, bankers and beggars, holy men and robbers, without making the slightest distinction between them. He recognized no differences of caste or social groupings, and the way he preached was open to all men and women who were ready to understand and to follow it. At the age of 80, the Buddha passed away at Kusinara, in modern-day Uttar Pradesh in India. Okay, I start off with that long passage from a modern introductory textbook because, in a sense, I think this is the life story of the Buddha that most of you might have heard and are familiar with. In today's mini lecture, however, what I want to do is introduce you to some of the primary sources in the Buddhist tradition itself that talk about the Buddha's life. And in doing so, I want to bring attention to how the primary sources might the primary sources might depict the Buddha's life differently than this source in a modern context. And also, I think as you start preparing for your exams, those of you preparing for exams for the GCSE or A-level, I think that you'll find that you need to be engaging with primary sources. So in this lecture, I'm going to tell you some of the most useful primary sources for you to use as you try to learn more about the Buddha's life. So let me just say a few things about the history of the Buddha. There's no consensus among scholars about his exact dates. Some scholars think it could be from 406 to 486 BCE. 486 to 406 BCE, or 480 to 360 BCE. But he lived about that time, somewhere between 400 and 300 before the Common Era. He also, it's important to know that even though we usually learn about Buddhism by starting with the life of the Buddha, that no complete biography of the Buddha was composed until several hundred years after his life. A number of the oldest accounts of his life are actually not from texts or stories that have survived, but from temple art. For example, there are 34 episodes from the Buddha's life depicted at the great monastery Sanchi, which still exists in ruins today in the middle of India. A number of these episodes at Sanchi's predate any textual literary accounts. Okay, now one of the things I think that's important for us to understand is that the Buddha's life story, as it's depicted in the Buddhist texts, I'm not saying it's not true. However, I think it's important to know is that the way that it is presented is very much in the context of Indian religious and philosophical literature. So in other words, many of the details about the Buddha's life are also details that we find in the lives of other great religious figures and religious teachers from the ancient Indian religious tradition. So, for example, the Buddha is known to have a miraculous birth, that he was born out of his mother's side. But this is also true of the great Hindu god Indra, who was born from his mother's side. The Buddha is famous for renouncing, for basically living a life of wandering and seeking religious truth. But this was a life that we hear stories about in the Upanishads of many of wealthy householders who leave their householding life to seek a life of religious truth and religious teaching. The Buddha probably has the most similarities, however, with another great religious teacher of his time. The name of this teacher was Mahavira, and Mahavira is famous for starting another religion called Jainism. Jainism probably started at least a generation or so before Buddhism started. So even though Buddhism is more widely known today, during the time of the Buddha, Jainism was the more established religion. It's interesting that the stories of Mahavira and the Buddha are very much the same. They both their stories start with their birth, their maturity, and then their renunciation, their search for truth and religious teachers, their awakening, then leading a life of teaching, and then finally passing away. Mahavira left his family and became a wandering ascetic at the age of 30, the Buddha 29. Mahavira was a wandering ascetic for 12 years, the Buddha for 6 years. Again, in saying these things, I'm not saying that the Buddha story isn't true, but what I am saying is that maybe some of the details about his story are more influenced by what was expected of the great life of a great religious teacher. Another thing that they have in common is that both the Buddha and Mahavira emphasized nonviolence, and both of them were members of the Kshatriya class. Now, just before we go any further, I just want to introduce to you a number of the names of the Buddha, because when you're looking at the primary sources, one of the things you'll find is that the Buddha is known by a number of different names, and he's actually not called the Buddha all that often. So I think it's important to be familiar with some of the various names that are used. So that way, when you're reading the primary sources, you have an idea of who they're talking about when they're talking about the Buddha. So of course, the name Buddha isn't his actual name given to him at birth, but the Buddha is more of a title. It's a title recognizing his achievement of having achieved enlightenment. The name Buddha means to be awake, to know, to understand. And it's also interesting within the Buddhist tradition, there are actually many Buddhas, not just one. So, in other words, the Buddha that is seen as sort of the founder of Buddhism, as we'll see, is depicted as one in a line of humans who have become enlightened. Now, his given name is Shakyamuni. I'm sorry, his family name is Shakyamuni, the sage from the tribe of the Shakyas. His family name is Gotama. Siddhartha is also a name that he's sometimes referred to, although this name comes a little bit later. So in other words, in the oldest sources, he's not known yet as Siddhartha. Now, another name that's used quite a lot in the early sources is Tathagata. This has a number of different connotations. The one who has gone forth, and is the most well-known one. And technically, this term can refer to anybody who's achieved enlightenment. Another word that's used quite a lot, and you'll see in some of the primary sources, is Bhagavad, which means Lord, or the Blessed One. And this is how he is referred to the most in the sources from the Pali Canon. Okay. One more thing before we look at some examples of the life story of the Buddha, and that is I just want to outline which primary sources we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at two texts in particular. One text is called the Digha Nikaya, and the Digha Nikaya is a collection of different suttas or different stories about the Buddha. And there are two suttas in particular that are some of the oldest in terms of offering a biographical account of the Buddha. One is called the Mahapadana Sutta, and the other one is called the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. And they were both composed in Pali, and we don't know exact dates of either one of these texts, but both of them were composed probably sometime between about 500 and 200 before the Common Era. Now, another text we're going to look at comes a little bit later, and this is the Buddha Charita. Interestingly, this is not a canonical Buddhist text. So this text is not a text that, say, Buddhists would have learned in the monastery as part of their training to be monks or nuns, but rather this is a Sanskrit drama that was composed by a Brahmin who is thought to have converted to Buddhism. And it means the story of the life of the Buddha, and it was composed in 200 BCE. Okay, so let's start with our first source, and this is the Mahapadana Sutta. Now, the way that this sutta starts, it starts with a frame story. In other words, it starts with a story of the Buddha talking to his followers, and it begins with the words, "Thus I have heard." And "thus I have heard" are the words that start every sutta in the Buddhist tradition. Now, in the frame story, a number of monks are gathered together, and they're discussing the former lives, trying to understand their own former lives and what it means that they all have former lives. And the Buddha is staying nearby. He hears the discussion with his divine hearing. I think it's important to realize that the Buddha in the ancient sources has special powers. And so he hears this, even though he's, out of regular earshot. And he goes to join the discussion and give the monks a proper teaching on past lives. And the sutta returns to this frame story throughout the text, But it's interesting that in this teaching, basically, in order to explain past lives, the Buddha gives an account of 7 previous Buddhas, including the first Buddha named Vipassi, who lived 7 eons ago. Now, it's interesting that when the Buddha then starts talking about the life of Vipassi, many of the things that Vipassi does during his life are exactly the things that are attributed later to the Buddha in his life. So, for example, his story of Vipassi begins before Vipassi was born. Just after he was born, when Brahmins are called to the court and they see that he has 32 marks on his body, and they predict that he will either be a future king or a great religious leader. Another thing that Vipassi does is he goes to the pleasure gardens, and in 4 different visits spanning, in Vipassi's case, hundreds of years, he has 4 sights. Again, you might know these sights from studying the life of the Buddha. He sees a sick man, an old man, a corpse, and then he sees a renunciate. After seeing these sights, he then shaves off his hair, puts on yellow robes, and wanders off on his own to seek enlightenment. Rather than talking about Vipassi visiting several teachers, however, he finds a secluded spot. He thinks about the conditions of aging and death, and then he becomes enlightened. And when he becomes enlightened, he understands the teaching of dependent origination. At first, he decides not to teach, but the god Brahma intervenes and tries to convince him, and does convince him, to share his knowledge. And his first teaching is about the 4 Noble Truths: suffering, its origin, its cessation, and the path. Then, basically, the Buddha says a few more things to round off the story. But then he reveals that this was one of his past lives. Now, what are some of the implications of this account? One of the things we can see is that this account is quite different from the account that I read out to you from the beginning of this lecture. I think one of the things we can say is that this account gives a slightly different meaning to the Buddha's life. It is not a personal account of a specific individual through his own insights becomes enlightened, but rather this sutta portrays Gautama as already destined to become the Buddha because of his actions in past lives. So in other words, this story, we might say, is more cosmological than historical. The Buddha's authority and the authority of his teachings is established by means of his connection to past individuals. In other words, through the lineage of his connection to his past lives. And the Buddha establishes his authority on his ability to remember the other Buddhas before him. Another thing this sutta does is it presents 3 of the most important Buddhist doctrines as embedded within his life story. Dependent origination, the 5 khandhas, or in Sanskrit, the 5 skandhas, and the 4 Noble Truths. Now, one of the things I want to leave you with are some discussion questions. And if you have a chance, you might want, I have a link to this story in the slideshow that's in the PowerPoints that accompany this lecture, is if you have a chance to read the Mahapadana Sutta, then you might want to think in more detail, what are some of the different details between Rahula's account and this account? And if the account in the Mahapadana Sutta were the ones presented in textbooks, I wonder, do you think Buddhism would be as popular today in the West? Why or why not? Does the account of the Mahabodhana Sutta make you think any differently about the Buddha's story? And if so, how? Does it change your understanding of Buddhism to think that there were other Buddhas and will be future ones? Okay, so I'll leave you to think about those questions on your own. But now I want to bring attention to another source, and this is the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. Now, this is the longest sutta in the early literature, and in many ways, it's the most sort of down-to-earth and personal account of his life, at least as represented in the Pali text. This sutta recounts his final journey. So in other words, this sutta is only about his last days, the last few months of his life, during which he travels around with his attendant Ananda. It also records his final words and describes his funeral. And this description also has influenced some Buddhist practice all the way up to the present day. Now, some of the main events. This sutta gives an account of his last meal. It gives an account of his instruction that his body should be wrapped in cloth and placed in a coffin and cremated. It also gives description about pilgrimage. The Buddha announces the 8 most important pilgrimage sites. And finally, this gives an account of the Buddha achieving his final nirvana while lying on his side, passing through 8 levels of meditational trance. And when he dies, when he finally passes on to reach his final nirvana, the cosmos responds in extraordinary ways. The text tells us the earth quivered, thunderbolts crashed down to earth, the moon's light waned, and rivers were filled with boiling water. Now, I think one of the things that for us to be thinking about is, how does this sutta characterize the Buddha? Now, in some ways, as I said, this story of the Buddha presents the Buddha as perhaps a little bit more down to earth than in the Mahapadana Sutta. This isn't talking about the Buddha in sort of a cosmological context. It's talking about him in a more sort of down to earth, we might even say real life type of context. But nevertheless, he does have miraculous powers. And I think it's really important for us to realize that according to all the Buddhist sources, the Buddha had miraculous powers, and these powers were very much part of the evidence that he had achieved enlightenment. So within this sutta, he can transport himself across a river. On another occasion, he's able to see a number of people's rebirth. And also he knows about the time of his death beforehand. But on the other hand, we see that the Buddha has human limitations. He is depicted as old and frail, and he also is quick to blame Ananda for not asking him to prolong his life. So even though he's very much an enlightened man, he seems to have some human weaknesses. Now, again, I'll leave it to you to read this source and to think more specifically about some of the details you find along the way, see how it fits into some of the categories that I've already suggested for you to think about. But some of the bigger questions now is, we might think about, how does this account differ from those of Wahula and the Mahabodhana Sutta? And in what ways is it similar? And then let's return to the question we asked about the other sutta with this sutta, and that is, does this account in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta make you think any differently about the Buddha's life story? And if so, how? Okay, now I want to share with you our final source for today's mini lecture, and this is the Buddha Charita. And in many ways, the Buddhacharita is probably the most similar account of the Buddha's life to the one that you're likely to see in textbooks. Buddhacharita means life of the Buddha. And as I said, this was composed by the playwright Ashvaghosha, and it was composed in Sanskrit about 200 CE. So anywhere from 500 to 600 years after the lifetime of the Buddha. Ashvaghosha was a Brahmin who converted to Buddhism, and this text was composed in a poetic style called kavya, the same style that a lot of great works of Sanskrit literature are composed in, for example, the Ramayana. So let's compare it with the Mahapadana Sutta. It has a lot of some of the same details. However, even some of these details vary slightly. So, for example, as with the Mahapadana Sutta, this account mentions the 32 marks of the Buddha. But whereas in the Mahapadana Sutta, after the Brahmins notice the 32 marks, the Buddha's father just thanks them for their prediction. Here, we get a more dramatic account. His father becomes afraid that his son will become a Buddha and not a king, and thus he attempts to steer him away from an interest in religion and becoming a religious teacher. Also, it's interesting that the four sights are dramatized as well. And in this account, the female attendants are blamed for convincing the Buddha to have a garden party. Also, we see his father trying to shelter his son from seeing anything harsh along the way. Again, some of these details you might even get from some of your textbooks. And then perhaps most dramatically is the departure from the palace. Remember in Wahula's account at the very beginning of this lecture, it said, and then suddenly the Buddha just wanted to, become enlightened one day. But this account gives the details of him sneaking out of his palace in the middle of the night while his wife and son are sleeping. So on the one hand, it makes the Buddha's search for enlightenment more dramatic. We see there's more of a sacrifice involved because he's leaving his wife and his son. But also, we might wonder if there's a sort of critical edge to this as well. Because after all, is it really a good idea for men to sneak out of their houses in the middle of the night, leaving their dependents behind for the sake of their personal quest? In any case, in the Buddhacharita, he lives a life of wandering, and he learns about various types of meditation. He has different teachers. He wanders for 6 years with 5 other ascetics. So a lot of the details, the really rich narrative details of this account, are not found in earlier sources, including the details of his enlightenment. Okay, now, the other thing about this account is that it not only, in a sense, draws from earlier accounts and adds more details to them, but this account also has more in common with a number of Hindu sources. So, for example, the very style and even some of the narrative structure is similar to the Hindu epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. It uses many motifs that are similar to Brahmanical courtly literature. Also, the Buddha's birth is compared to other famous kings, and the Buddha's wife is described as an incarnation of the goddess Shri, who's often considered more of a Hindu goddess. And interestingly here, this is a trope we see in the Hindu epics when many of the princesses in the Ramayana and the Mahabharata are compared to the goddess Shri as well. When he departs to the forest, it's compared to Rama departing for the forest in the Ramayana. And the Buddha's father's grief is compared to the Rama's father's grief from the Ramayana. As Patrick Olivelle, who is a translator and great scholar of this text, says, Ashvaghosha, the author of this account, presents the Buddha's teachings as the consummation and fulfillment of the Brahmanical or Hindu tradition. So in other words, one of the things going on in this source is that this source wasn't composed for Buddhist monks, but people who were not Buddhist already. And by sharing all these details with the Hindu tradition, makes the Buddha more acceptable to non-Buddhists. Okay. Let me just finish with some discussion questions. Again, how does this account differ from some of the other accounts we've looked at? What are some of the similarities? One of the things that might be worth thinking about further, though, is why this contains so many comparisons between the Buddha and Hindu figures such as Rama. And also, if you do have a chance to read this account, it's a lot longer than the other sources I've talked about. But one of the perspectives I think that's really worth looking at in this account is the character of Yashodhara, which is the Buddha's wife. And we get her account of how she feels when she finds out that the Buddha has left the palace in the middle of the night. And I think if you go and you look at her lament to find that her husband has left her, we get a sort of interesting critical insight into what it might be like from a female perspective when not only the Buddha but other monks decide to join the Buddhist tradition. Okay, before finishing up, let me just leave you with some general implications. One of the things, despite the differences, one of the things I think that all of these accounts have in common is this sense that the Buddha's life is a demonstration of his teachings. This isn't meant to be just a history. It's not meant to be just full of facts, and that's it. But the Buddha's life is very much the path, or a path, an exemplary path to follow for anybody who wants to be a Buddha. And so his life is presented as the middle way between extreme asceticism and opulent materialism. And that one of the other things going on is that the story of the Buddha itself is used to emphasize particular teachings. And one of the things that almost all accounts agree upon, and that is that the teaching or the knowledge that the Buddha realized when he became enlightened was dependent origination. So it's very clear in the early sources that not only was this an important teaching, but this was the important teaching. Why? Because it characterizes the enlightened perspective itself. But then, of course, another teaching that's very much emphasized in these early accounts is the teaching of the Four Noble Truths. How is that emphasized? Because in account after account, this is the Buddha's first teaching after he becomes enlightened.